All right, let's go ahead and get started. Go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Daniel chapter 2. And if you've got your notes, we're going to be starting in verse 14 this evening. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see that screen okay?
Looks good.
Okay, awesome. All right, so we're in Daniel chapter 2. We're kind of picking up in the middle of the story that we started last week. And this is the account of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And if you recall, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. In fact, according to verse 1, it looks like he had multiple dreams, or probably the same dream multiple times. And it was a very disturbing dream for him. It caused a lot of anxiety for him. He was really upset, if you will, about this dream and what it meant. And you remember, from a pagan mindset, the idea was that when you had a dream, their mindset was that the gods, plurality of gods, this polytheistic thinking, were trying to communicate something to him. And so he was very anxious to understand the meaning of this dream. But you can see really here in the first 13 verses of Daniel chapter 2 that Nebuchadnezzar, at this point in his kingdom, has grown suspicious of his wise men. And he's probably grown up seeing them do what they do, which is in the past they would maybe take somebody's dream. They would go to books that had been written about dreams and then try to put together, multiple quotes, multiple thoughts, and then give somebody an interpretation. And he was starting, I believe, to lose confidence in that type of approach. In fact, the reason we see that is because he in his dream here, he brought his wise men in to give him the understanding, but he wouldn't tell them the dream. He wanted them to tell him what his dream was first and then provide the interpretation. And this was the back and forth that we looked at last week through verse 13. In fact, it didn't end well. It ended very violent and hasty. And this is really kind of sets the stage for tonight. But if you recall in we'll just read from verse 10. It says, "The Chaldeans answered the king and said, 'There is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such things of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh.'" And so really their comments set the stage beautifully, because Nebuchadnezzar is now going to find out that there is a God who reveals dreams. It's not their gods. It's not the false gods that they worship. It's the one true God. So they set the stage well, saying this is impossible. Nobody can do this. And now Daniel's going to have an opportunity here this evening to step in as we look at this passage. But notice the king's response, and this is key. This kind of puts the urgency on the situation. Verse 12. "For this reason, the king was angry and very furious, and he gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon." So the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Now you remember back in chapter 1, the Daniel and his friends had been promoted, if you will, and in the sense of they were promoted up. They were recognized as having this knowledge and skill. And they, as verse 20 of chapter 1 says, "In all the matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Darius." And so we see that they were kind of starting to stand out amongst, and we see that their lives, as we get to chapter 2, verse 13, they're on the line right now. And so this kind of introduces us really to this evening's section. We're going to finish chapter 2 this evening. And that is Daniel's crisis response, which we see in verse 14 through 18. Let's go ahead and read that section. "Then with counsel and wisdom Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree from the king so urgent? Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time that he might tell the king the interpretation. And so let's kind of pick up here. This man Arioch was one of the king's bodyguards, and he was the one who was commanded to function as an executioner. And what we're going to look at is that Daniel's response is truly remarkable. He's, as the next point says, he doesn't panic. He speaks wisely to Arioch. In fact, the text tells us that he replied with discretion, or as the New King James says, with counsel. And what that word or that phrase meant is that he made a careful and guarded and humble inquiry. And he also replied with discernment, meaning he replied with good judgment and understanding. Now, those of you who have ever been in a highly stressful situation, I don't know if anyone here has ever been in a situation where you were at threat of losing your life. That seems to be as highly stressful as it could get. But you're going to see that Daniel and his friends, they respond with such extreme wisdom, which can only come because they're actually leaning into the Lord. And we're going to kind of see that exhibited here as we read further in this account. But it's just amazing how remarkable they respond in this situation. And largely, as this point says, it's because of his confidence, because of Daniel's confidence in God. He was able to have great tact and self-control in a life and death situation. And so we'll kind of see how this bears itself out. We'll also see that even though Daniel is making wise and discerning requests, we also see that God is really working behind the scenes on behalf of Daniel to give them an appropriate response from the leaders in Babylon. In verse 15, Daniel politely and yet boldly asked about the urgency or the extreme harshness of the king's death sentence for the wise men. It's kind of like, man, why is he jumping to this extreme? It's kind of what he's saying, but he's saying it in a very tactful, wise way. And Arioch, the executioner, he just unquestioningly obeyed the king's decree. The fact that he took the time to listen to Daniel actually showed God's intervention. In fact, if we go back in the account, verses 7 through 9, the king had just denied all his wise men extra time. And now Daniel's asking for extra time, and we're going to see that he gets it. So look at verses 7 through 8. They answered again, this is the wise men of Babylon, and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know for certain that you would gain time, because you see that my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time is changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. See, he wasn't going to give them more time, because the king was suspicious. If he gave them more time, it was just going to give them more time to think up and come up with some kind of baloney response, and he didn't want that anymore. And not only that, but he was done giving them time, because we see in verse 13 that they had already began killing the wise men. So there had been wise men already that had lost their death. He was out of time. So the fact that Daniel asked for more time and actually gets it granted shows that God was intervening on their behalf. And so by Daniel's actions, he not only prevented the death of his fellow advisors, but he also obtained Arioch's cooperation. And we'll see that God really gave him favor with Nebuchadnezzar's bodyguard and executioner, which is just a miracle in and of itself. And so in verse 16, Daniel's success in postponing the executions ordered by the king was yet another proof of God's gracious intervention. He asked for time to consider the dream, and we're going to see that he trusted the Lord to make it known to him. And so in an interesting turn of events, Daniel's request for more time was granted when the other wise men's request had been denied. And so we kind of looked at that earlier in the account. Now I want you to see in verses 17 through 18 what Daniel did immediately after he's granted this request for more time. We read in verse 17, then Daniel went to his house, and he made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions. These were the three that were with him in chapter 1, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. And so we see that his first task was prayer. And so Daniel and his friends made specific requests of God. And the first thing we see that they prayed for was God's mercy. This request stood in stark contrast with the king's lack of compassion. It's an interesting prayer request, right? He's in verse 18. They were seeking the mercies from God. Now, why mercy? Well, remember the difference between mercy and grace. Mercy is you don't get what you deserved. Grace is you get something good that you don't deserve. And so they're seeking or mercies from God, from Yahweh. Why mercies? Why did they feel like they got something they deserved? Well, remember, they were a rebellious nation that had been taken into exile. They weren't claiming that God should spare their life or that they deserved to have their life spared. They knew that in many ways, they, along with the children of Israel, were under the judgment, the disciplining hand of God. And so they're seeking his mercies. They're begging mercy from the Lord concerning this dream, because a death sentence awaited them if they could not understand the dream and provide the interpretation. Second, they also prayed concerning the mystery. This clearly showed that they were confident that God knew the contents of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And the fact that they knew God was omniscient, again, reflects the depths of their spiritual upbringing. We're going to see that these young men understood the Word of God. They had been trained, they had been taught, they had studied. Now, whether or not they had made it their own before they left Israel, or if the exile kind of sped that process up and then they owned it when they were in Babylon, we don't really know that time frame, but we know that by this time, they've been through that 3-year training program, most likely, and they are now owning their faith, and we're going to see that going forward. So they don't know if God's going to reveal the mystery. They're asking him to reveal this mystery or this secret, this secret dream that nobody knows. Letter C, they prayed that they would not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men. This statement may imply that the executioners had already killed some of the advisors. Based on verse 13 that we looked at, they already had. So it's a pretty safe bet to say some of the advisors that they probably knew had already been killed. And so it was right there on their front doorstep. And again, they're begging God to allow them to live. They're begging for his mercy in terms of their life here. And so even though these were young men, not seasoned statement, they already knew how to trust the Lord. And so we're going to see later, in fact, we're going to see in the next verse here that Daniel is going to receive the details of the dream in a night vision. But we're also going to see that Daniel includes his partners as he reveals the dream to Nebuchadnezzar in verse 36. Notice this, he says, this is the dream. And he says, now we will tell you the interpretation of it. We'll tell the interpretation of it before the king. Notice he says we. So he's including his partners here in this process. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are with him in declaring this dream to Nebuchadnezzar, although the dream was revealed specifically to Daniel, as we'll learn here in the next verse. So in verse 19 through 23, we see that the secret is revealed to Daniel, and when it's revealed to him, he praises the Lord. And so verse 19 says, then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And then we'll look at his prayer. We'll kind of read that separately. But one of the things that we see is that God answered Daniel and his 3 friends' prayers by means of a vision. Again, this vision was God's way of giving special revelation to Daniel. Earlier, last week, we had studied about the differences between dreams and visions, how dreams were given to believers and unbelievers. Obviously, Nebuchadnezzar's an unbeliever. He received a dream, a special revelation from God about the history of Gentile rule over Israel from that point until his coming kingdom. And now, in order to reveal the contents of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, God gives Daniel a vision. So he's using both of dreams and visions in this chapter to reveal truth. Now, one of the things that we see is Daniel did not explain the specifics of how God made the vision known to him, but Daniel 1:17 clearly says that God was the one who gave Daniel the ability to understand visions and dreams. We see that in 1:17. It says, and as for these four young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel, he singles him out here, had understanding in all visions and dreams. So this seems to be a gifting that God had given specifically to Daniel. And so the group prayed together, but then Daniel was the one that received this vision to have the ability to understand not only what Nebuchadnezzar's dream was, but also to interpret the meaning of his dream. And so amazingly in this passage, God used four inexperienced Hebrew youths to refute the combined wisdom of the godless intellectual elite. And God and his character, doesn't change, obviously. I think he derives great pleasure in using the weak things to confound the wise. And that's why 1 Corinthians 1:27 through 29 is there. It's just a great passage. It says, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty. And the base things of the world and the things which are despised, God has chosen, and the things which are not, to bring to nothing the things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence. And for a second here, at the end of chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar is not going to glory in his presence. In fact, he's going to give glory to the God of Daniel and these three young Hebrew young men. But God is using these captive young men to confound the wisdom of all of the seasoned wise men in Babylon. And I think the Lord takes delight in that then, and I think he takes delight in that now as well. And now we want to look at Daniel's prayer to God. He responded to this gracious provision of this vision from God, and he responds in this amazing prayer of praise. In fact, in this prayer of thanksgiving, Daniel quoted from several Old Testament passages, including, you can write these down and look at them later, Exodus 3, Psalm 75, Psalm 139, and 2 Samuel 14. And so let's read the prayer of praise here, and then we'll make another comment or two on this section. So Daniel answered, verse 20, and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever. His wisdom, for wisdom and might are his. And he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's demand. And so you see this just bursting forth. And again, to have all of these Old Testament passages interwoven in this prayer, it just shows us that these are teachings, and these are sections of the scriptures that he must have heard as a child. It shows us that he had a clear understanding of God's word. In fact, when you read through that prayer, you could notice really specifically who Daniel's praise was focused on. It's all about God. It's all about his character. It's all about what he can do and what others can't do. And what it tells us is this, is that the Babylonians desire to brainwash them and his partners to actually put them through this 3-year training period to erase their Jewish heritage, to erase their national loyalties to the one true God. We see that they were ineffective, that Daniel and his friends are still walking with the Lord, even though they've been exposed to this brainwashing training that the Babylonians forced them to go through. And what it tells us is this, from a big picture perspective, from God's promises to the nation of Israel, that God had his young men in place, and they're growing up right in the middle of the most powerful Gentile pagan empire in the world. But God has got them there for a reason. And we're going to see that God is going to utilize these events in the lives of these pagans to elevate Daniel and his friends to positions of authority. And so when Daniel mentions in verse 23 this biological lineage, it should bring to mind God's contract with Abraham and his descendants through Isaac and Jacob. And we'll look at that more closely at the end of this study, but the Abrahamic covenant, he's referencing in verse 23, he says, I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers, right? He's referencing back to the promises, I believe, the contract that he made with Abraham. And so what I love about this is you see these young men, they are now in a position where they have owned their relationship, their own relationship with the Lord. And this relationship they have with the Lord has some depth to it. And we're going to learn later that while in Babylon, that Daniel consistently fellowshiped with the Lord through prayer. In fact, Daniel 6:10, when, this is later in his life, but we're going to read this. Now, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and then notice what it says about him. And in his upper room with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. And so Daniel clearly owned his relationship with the Lord. And we'll see later when we get to chapter 6, the reason that he was facing toward Jerusalem was because that's exactly what Solomon told Jews to do if they were ever taken into exile, that they would face toward the temple that they were dedicating, and that God would hear their prayer and return them to his land. And so Daniel, again, there at the end of his life, is following the prescriptions in the Word of God. And so now Daniel gets a personal audience with the king. And we see his introduction to revealing the king's dreams. So in verse 24, let's go ahead and read that. Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me before the king, and I will tell the king the interpretation. Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said thus to him, I have found a man of the captives of Judah who will make known to the king the interpretation. All right, and so verse 24, we see that Daniel followed correct protocol, by asking Arioch the executioner to secure an audience for him with the king. This in and of itself was dangerous. This man obviously had present orders to kill all the wise men in Babylon, including Daniel. So he had found favor with him earlier. He had bought some time. Now he's got the interpretation, and he goes back to Arioch. So all of this is still very tenuous, because if Arioch was having a bad day, was irritated by something and saw Daniel come in, he might have forgotten he had given him extra time and just taken him out. So God is still working behind the scenes here to protect Daniel and his friends. Now we see in verse 25, in a somewhat comical fashion, Arioch took credit for finding Daniel. I don't know if you picked that up in the wording, but he says, I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can make the interpretation known to the king. Now, it's interesting because he doesn't hedge his bets there. He literally puts his neck on the line. He is trusting that Daniel is telling him the truth and that Daniel has an accurate interpretation. He's saying, I've found the man that's going to tell you what your dream's about. And so in some ways, I think Arioch is kind of comically taking credit for this. But you will notice, and this happens a lot in the book of Daniel, is he doesn't say, I found a man amongst your wise men. Notice how he specifically says, I found a man of the captives of Judah. And they're going to keep bringing that up all throughout Daniel, all throughout his life, that he is a captive of Judah. It's just kind of a subtle way of, if you will, keeping him distinct from the Babylonians, never becoming quite part of their culture, and always being viewed, a little less than, because they were an exiled people group, not a homegrown Babylonian. So we'll see that. We'll bring that out as we go through Daniel, but we see that a lot, that they'll kind of make mention of that. And so the king is interested. The king answered in verse 26 and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? And so despite Daniel's youth, right, he's still a teenager possibly, or maybe early 20s. It depends on how old exactly he was when he was brought to Babylon. But he spoke boldly, we'll see, to the most powerful potentate on earth at that time. This took great confidence in God. 1 Timothy 4:12 tells Timothy, let no one despise your youth. And so Daniel was functioning according to that principle as well. He could have really shied away, being so young. What do I have to say to a king? But his confidence was in the Lord, and he knew he had the interpretation to the dream. Verse 27 and 28. Then Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. It's funny, Daniel reminds the king how all of his men, and I think he's doing it politely. I don't think he's, being obnoxious about it. But he simply reminds Nebuchadnezzar that all of his men couldn't do what Daniel's about to do. And then Daniel's going to set it up. He says, your guys couldn't do it. But verse 28, but there's a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. Okay, and so Daniel sets the stage. Your guys couldn't do it. My God can. Here it is. And so he's kind of setting the stage for Nebuchadnezzar. Now the dream, you'll notice he tells him that this dream had to do with what would take place in the latter days, or the remaining days of human rule on earth, especially concerning Gentile domination of Israel. Remember, the whole point of the book of Daniel, the whole point of this dream in Nebuchadnezzar has here in Daniel chapter 2, is to reveal the times of the Gentiles for the sole purpose of showing that one day God is going to send his kingdom to crush all other kingdoms. But he's describing what's going to happen as Jesus described in Luke 21 as the times of the Gentiles. And so through this statement, his statement in verses 27b through 28a, you'll see that Daniel faulted the wise men of Babylon by tactfully showing the bankruptcy of the Babylonian religious system, which was incapable of knowing or revealing the dream. In fact, it would have been very hard for Nebuchadnezzar to even argue this point, because no one amongst Babylonians, the Babylonian wise men, had been able to tell the king the dream, even under threat of death. They haven't been able to come up with anything. So Daniel's just simply pointing out facts here. He's not really, I don't believe, being obnoxious. Obviously, he's being very respectful, but he's just pointing out they couldn't do it. But let me tell you about my God who can. And so he shielded them by wisely pointing out that only the God of heaven, someone that they didn't know or worship, could reveal mysteries. Now, it's a really great point, because Daniel doesn't throw the other wise men under the bus necessarily. He points out, yeah, it is too hard for them. They're not equipped to do it. In fact, King, I'm not equipped to do it, is what he's going to tell us here in a second. Only the God of heaven is equipped to do it. So he's really kind of deflecting the king's attention and praise toward Yahweh. Not even really overly being critical of his wise men, the other Babylonian wise men that he knew. And so in verse 29, he says, as for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while on your bed about what would come to pass after this. And he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be. And so no doubt Nebuchadnezzar was surprised that Daniel knew what he had been thinking at the time of his dream. Daniel knew the king had been thinking about the future. In other words, it's just an incredible statement here, because Daniel went a step further than what the king even asked. He told the king what he was actually doing and thinking about before he had the dream. These were the thoughts probably that he was having prior to going to sleep that led up to his dream. Daniel had even backed it up another step. The king just wanted to know what his dream, for someone to tell him what his dream was and to provide the interpretation. Daniel said, I know what you were thinking about before you had the dream. Then I'll tell you the dream, and then I'll give you the interpretation. So he actually backs up a step here, as verse 29 tells us. And in verse 30, we read this, but as for me, this secret has not been revealed to me, because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for our sakes who make known the interpretation to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. And so it's very important to see Daniel's humility here. He didn't want Nebuchadnezzar to exalt him personally. He wanted to make sure the king understood who deserved the glory. And basically it was the God of heaven who deserved the glory. And so Daniel was used to was used, I believe, because he trusted God and he willingly presented himself for service. And so we've got some New Testament passages that describe that kind of mindset even in our day as we walk with the Lord. And so Daniel's now going to provide an accurate description of the dream here in verses 31 through 35. And it's going to be a spot on description. It's like Daniel was there watching, got to see his dream on a big screen. And we know God revealed it to Daniel in a vision. And so he's going to see it very clearly. Let's read it and we'll come back and kind of talk about it. Verse 31, you, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found, and the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. And so this is his dream. Daniel just told him what he dreamed. This is what the wise men couldn't figure out. They didn't know. Hadn't seen this. And so this dream, we'll see, describe the coming domination of humankind by various world empires until the end of fallen man's rule on earth. And so the idea is that God, in this dream to Nebuchadnezzar, gave his complete plan for the ages through this dream, leading up to and all the way to when he establishes his kingdom on earth, which is an eternal kingdom. So it's this description of human history, Gentile rule, man's government on earth, all the way to when it will be destroyed and God will establish his own kingdom on earth. That's, again, it's going to be an eternal kingdom. The 1,000-year earthly reign is kind of the kickoff party for the eternal kingdom. And so that's what's being described here in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. This word awesome that's used in verse 31 is an Aramaic word which means to fear. And so the statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream was large and of extraordinary splendor, meaning it was huge and dreadful. And you can kind of see, it's hard to imagine that this would be a scary thing, but some dreams are kind of funny, right? I mean, there are things in dreams that scare us sometimes that wouldn't scare us normally, or wouldn't seem so dreadful normally if we saw it. But this was the case in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. It caused, at some level, some fear, and I think this is why he was so anxious to understand what it was and what it meant. And so Daniel just proceeded to reveal the details of the statue. He doesn't just say, oh, you had a statue. Okay, that's the dream. He goes through and he describes it in detail. He says that the statue portrayed both diversity and unity. It was a single statue made of 5 substances. We know the head was made of gold. We know that the chest and arms were made of silver. We know the abdomen and the thighs were made of bronze. We know the legs were made of iron. And then we know the feet were made of iron mixed with clay. And so one of the things we can observe about this statue is that the 4 metals in the statue declined in value from top to bottom. In other words, the most valuable metal is the head of gold. And then it just slowly declined in value. We also know that the weight of the upper metals was greater than the weight of the lower metals. Okay, so it's kind of starting up really high. It's just kind of degrading, if you will, or going to a cheaper, less valuable, less weighted metals. But we also know that the metals also transition from softer metals at the top to harder, more durable metals at the bottom. And so these are just observations about the statue, just based on what it was made out of. The head was one solid piece of gold. It was the least divided part of the statue, right? It's one head. Everything else is you've got chest and arms, you've got abdomens and thighs, this division, this kind of split two here. The legs were made of iron, 2 legs, and then you've got 2 feet with mixed with iron and clay, so that the head of gold was the least divided part of the statue. And then all the other sections were comprised, as I just said, of left and right sides, even 2 body parts. Additionally, the feet were made of 2 non-mixing substances, iron and clay. In fact, I'm not a metal worker by any means, but I've been told and have read that if you mix iron with clay, it actually makes both of the materials weaker. It's a weaker structure than if you just had one or the other. And so it's getting weaker even as it goes down. And so the feet were actually the weakest part of the statue because they were composed of 2 incompatible materials. In other words, you could blend them together, but they wouldn't truly blend, so to speak. And so it ended up being the weakest part of the statue, which is a great description of human government, right? And we don't need much convincing of that it's standing on a weak foundation to begin with in terms of how they attempt to govern mankind. And that's true of government anywhere, human government anywhere. And so the statue, we learn in verse 34, was destroyed with a crushing blow to the feet. And so the idea is that final piece of the statue was what was attacked, as you see this stone that was cut out without hands. It was that stone that struck the image on its feet and broke the statue into pieces. And so what we're going to see when we get into the prophetic section of Daniel is that all of these pieces of the statues represent succeeding world empires known as the kingdoms of men. And so we will get into that when we get into the prophetic section of Daniel, and we'll get into a lot of detail. So I'm going to leave that detail out now. We'll read through it and talk about it. But what we're going to ultimately see is that the Babylonian Empire is represented by the head of gold. Let's read verse 36. This is the dream. Now we will tell you the interpretation of it before the king. Notice again, he includes his friends there. Verse 36, we will tell you. Verse 37, you, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory, and wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hand. He has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. And so we see it clearly that Nebuchadnezzar and his Babylonian empire are represented by the head of gold in the statue. But as we go on, we see in verse 39, but after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And so we see the Medo-Persian Empire, this torso and arms of silver, right? Which arose immediately following Babylon. In fact, we're going to be introduced to this kingdom in chapter 6. And then after that, the Grecian Empire, this third kingdom of bronze there, right there around the midsection and the thighs, is going to arise. And then in verse 40, we see the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything, and like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. And so that is, we'll see that the legs there of iron is going to represent the Roman Empire. So this statue, this dream represents these kingdoms of men on earth. Now, this picture I found on the internet, I don't know if I would call that the feet mixture, the Holy Roman Empire. I think I know where they're going with that, but definitely the top 4 are that. But something unique happens with the feet, and let's talk about that again. Verse 41. Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay, partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay, They will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. And so we'll talk more about that kingdom when we get into the prophetic section of Daniel. But it's a mixture, I believe, of Roman governance and thinking, and again we'll talk more about that when we get into the prophetic section. And so that kind of sets us up for this stone, right? This stone that's cut without hands, that's going to crush this statue, all the materials as Daniel saw in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And the stone that destroyed the statue represents the Messiah and his eternal kingdom. And so we read about that in verse 44. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. And so we see that this stone cut without hands is going to be Jesus Christ and his kingdom as reflected in Revelation, his coming in Revelation 19, and his establishment of his kingdom in Revelation 20. That's when we see the fulfillment, this final stage of world governance that the Lord Jesus himself will initiate. And so Christ will become the universal and perfect ruler of all time. And after his arrival, fallen humanity will never again rule humankind. So what a blessing to look forward, obviously, to that day. And so we just read through this section, Daniel's accurate interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Again, he keeps bringing up his friends, and we see that he perfectly described the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. And as a reminder, Nebuchadnezzar had never disclosed this dream to anybody. So this fact by itself would have fully validated his ensuing interpretation to Nebuchadnezzar. And so again, as I said, we're going to save the interpretation of the dream for our prophetic study section. We're going to plan on diving into it in much more detail then. We're going to be tying not only Daniel 2, but Daniel 7 also to the book of Revelation when we go through that prophetic section. So be patient. We'll get there. I know that's kind of a fun thing to study, and we'll get there soon, obviously. And so now as we get into verse 46 through 49, we're going to see that Daniel, as a result of giving Nebuchadnezzar not only the dream, but the interpretation, is going to be promoted as well as his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In verse 46, we read that then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, prostrate before Daniel, and commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. So King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face. He did homage to Daniel, and he gave orders to present to him an offering and fragrant incense. And in that moment, Nebuchadnezzar was obviously overwhelmed, and he's taking steps really to worship Daniel, ironically enough, or at least to show him high honor if he wasn't worshiping him. And this was in a manner that was totally uncharacteristic of any king. And so Nebuchadnezzar fell down, he paid homage to Daniel, and he rewarded Daniel just as he promised to do for the person who interpreted his dream. All the way back in Daniel chapter 2, verse 6, if you recall, Nebuchadnezzar had said, "However, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor." And so he's basically saying anyone that can do that is going to receive gifts, reward, and great honor. And now we're going to see him really carry out his promise to Daniel. And so in verse 47, let's read that. The king answered Daniel and said, "Truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret." And so although Nebuchadnezzar did praise Daniel's God, we're going to see going forward that his mind was not yet completely changed about Daniel's God. We're going to see that he's still growing in his understanding. In fact, we're going to see that in chapter 3. We're going to see that in chapter 4 as well. And so in verse 48, it says, "Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon." And so in reality, we know it was God who moved the king to promote Daniel to the position of governor of Babylon. We see a similar occurrence. In fact, Daniel may have even been thinking about this story and this narrative that he had probably read growing up about Joseph with Pharaoh, right? Joseph, in chapter 41 of Genesis, Pharaoh in verse 38 says to his servants, "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." This is exactly what just happened to Daniel. And so Daniel probably is like, "Oh man, I read about that story in Genesis. Now it's happening to me." We also know that Daniel became the chief leader of all the wise men in Babylon, right? We saw that at the end of verse 48. This is very significant as we look at the Christmas story in Matthew 2, because Daniel was able to set up a new sect of wise men in Babylon who came to be called the Magi. And in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 2, we read about these Magi who came from the east to Jerusalem to celebrate the birth of the King of the Jews, right? So again, think about this dream that Daniel just interpreted. God is going to establish a kingdom that's going to crush all of these other kingdoms. Daniel was teaching this to the wise men in Babylon, and years later, we're talking about 600 years later, this group of Magi are still in place. And they are probably timing, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but they're probably timing Daniel chapter 9 in the revelation given to Daniel, the prophecy given of the 70 weeks, and they're tracing him. So in Matthew 2:1, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem." These are the men who had been they hadn't been personally trained by Daniel. That was 600 years earlier. But this was the set of men who had been trained through the years in the ways that Daniel was teaching, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." And so this was where these men had come from. And in verse 49, we see in his foreknowledge, power, and grace, God put these four men in influential positions in government. It says, "Also Daniel petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel sat in the gate of the king." And so Daniel had a higher position, but he had promoted, gotten these three friends promoted to positions of leadership. And what just an incredible way for God to have leaders in place to care for the Jewish exiles. And so while Daniel was sitting at the king's court, we see at the end of verse 49, the fact that Daniel was specifically governing in the king's court, and he was ruler over the whole province, it put him in a higher position than his three friends. This could also explain why Daniel was absent at the event where his three friends were cast into the fiery furnace, which we're going to read about next week. And so this chapter, Daniel chapter 2, and Nebuchadnezzar's dream, it really sets the stage for chapter 3. And so we're really uncertain if Nebuchadnezzar misunderstood the dream, or he got a separate but a related idea for his kingdom based on the dream. But the dream and what he does in chapter 3 seem to be related at some level. It seems to be why he does what he does in chapter 3. And just as a kind of an intro to next week, let's look at some of the results of the dream here for Nebuchadnezzar. So again, Daniel had just told and interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream about the image of different metals in chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, as we saw, was represented by a head of gold. And as we'll see, this appears to go to his head. Unfortunately, his kingdom's represented by the head of the gold, and he saw that, and this kind of goes to his head. And the fact that he was the head of gold must have resonated with his pride. Because what we're going to see is, although he appears to praise Daniel's God in Daniel 2:47, and he promotes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in 2:49, we're gonna ask the question: does this mean that the king is converted at this point? Chapter 3 is going to show us that is not yet the case. Chapter 4 is going to show that to us as well. So clearly Nebuchadnezzar reinterpreted or misinterpreted Daniel's clear explanation of his dream and in some way envisioned something other than what God meant. In fact, it may have even been his prideful, rebellious way to say, you know what? I know God said another kingdom's going to come in, but you know what? I'm gonna just keep ruling. I think I'm going to keep my kingdom going forever. I mean, who knows what was in his mind, why he made the entire statue of gold. But the dream in chapter 2, although Nebuchadnezzar's dream was not ultimately about him and his kingdom, it was about God's kingdom and what would transpire in Gentile kingdoms throughout the course of human history prior to God establishing his kingdom on earth. So Nebuchadnezzar really missed the whole point of the dream. Just like many people, he saw only himself in the dream, and yet there was a lot more going on being revealed that was not concerning him, but he obviously locked into the area that was concerning him. And in this dream, if we can just summarize and tie in the Old Testament, it was simply a re-emphasis and restatement of the Davidic covenant and an eternal king reigning in an eternal kingdom. And so again, how comforting to know for Daniel and his friends and the other Jews in exile that God intended to keep his promises to the nation of Israel even while they sat in exile due to the rebellion. If you remember the Davidic covenant, we'll kind of close here this evening. 1 Samuel chapter 7. 1 Samuel chapter 7 and I'm sorry, not 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. I'm looking at the wrong one. 2 Samuel chapter 7 is where we find the Davidic covenant. And it says, when your days are fulfilled, speaking to David, God speaking to David, and you rest with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name. Now he's talking specifically about Solomon here, but we'll see where he's talking past Solomon as well. He says, he shall build a house for my name, which Solomon did, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, he shall be my son. If he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the blows of the sons of men. But my mercy shall not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. And then notice this promise, in your house, David, and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. And remember, the Davidic covenant is simply an expansion on the seed promise in the Abrahamic covenant. And so this is exactly what this dream did in chapter 2. It re-emphasized and it restated that God intended to fulfill his promises made in the Davidic covenant, that he was going to send a king, that he was going to establish a kingdom. And so it would be an eternal kingdom. And we'll get more details about that even when we get into Daniel chapter 7 and some other places. And so, all right, I think let's stop there for the night. And we'll pick up next week in Daniel chapter 3. Our goal next week will be to finish Daniel chapter 3. And then we're going to take a little bit of a break on Sunday night. It's just a very busy month for me personally, and also for the church in terms of the evangelism outreaches. And so we'll take a little bit of a break. That'll be a good breather. There's stretches there in that month where I'm not home any night of the week. And so you can pray for me if you think about me, just for strength and wisdom too, to, not just ignore everybody in my life for a month. I want to be a good husband, be a good father, be a good pastor, be a good friend, etc., and not just write everybody off for a month, but just pray for me, be a good volleyball coach, which I need a lot of work there, but anyways, just pray for me. I'd appreciate it. But we'll meet again next week. We'll cover Daniel chapter 3. The notes are up on our website if you want to print those out before next week. We'll have a couple of hard copies in the adult Sunday school room as well. Does anybody have any comments or questions? Did anybody miss any blanks that I can help them with as well? Okay. Awesome. That's we'll kind of just take that. There's no questions or comments. I'm gonna close us in prayer. I appreciate you guys coming out tonight. I hope Hope this study is an encouragement to you. And like I said, we'll keep going. Hold tight, be patient. We're going to get into the prophetic sections. I know those are really fun to get into. I'm looking forward to that myself. But I really want to spend time just kind of soaking in these narrative portions because I think it gives us the context of what's going on. And they're really fun to see God's character and the way he's working, the way he keeps his promises, the way he's faithful, those kind of things. So let me pray and we'll close it out tonight. Lord, thanks so much for your word. We just love to see you act and move and intercede and just be involved with your children. Here, obviously, in the Old Testament, we're looking at your interactions with the children of Israel. And obviously, Lord, you are a gracious Father to each one of us, and you move and you interact with us on a daily basis. We're so grateful for that. This opportunity to have an intimate, personal fellowship with you is such a blessing. And so we want to take advantage of that every moment of every day, Lord. May we never be comfortable. May we never get comfortable being out of fellowship with you. And so we pray for each one here and each one that wanted to come but couldn't, and each person in our church family, Lord, that you would just be with them this week and encourage them to look up, to seek those things which are above, to set their mind on those things, including yourself. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.